My name is Fernando Montenegro. I'm a security professional with some gray hair that I'm based out of Toronto, and thank you very, very much for having me here. Why are we talking about this? Why economics? What are we going to talk about this? It's the notion that when we talk about security in general, we're talking about all the technical aspects of it. There is something else going on as well. And at the end of the day, there are technical elements to what we're doing, but there's also the non-technical stuff. This is a non-technical talk, if you will. And what we're doing is we're talking about how humans interact, right? Economics fundamentally is the study of scarcity, and we'll get to that in a second. And this plays a part here because resources are not infinite. Attention is not infinite. The incentives of why people do things are very well defined in economics, and I think that as security professionals, if we understand that, we're going to have a lot more success as a profession. This is the topics from this presentation derived from a MOOC I took at edX a little while ago called The Economics of Information Security, which I thought were extremely interesting. So this is not so much a lecture as almost like a book report on what did I come across, and with a little bit of what I added. Before people ask, the slides will be up on SlideShare. I timed it so they'll be released at 11 o'clock. And if you need to, they'll have additional content on the slides that they're not here as well. So a little bit about me. I'm currently a sales engineer at a startup dealing in the network security space. I've had a number of professional services roles. I've done some operations. I've done some architecture. As it says here, my degree is from '94, which I like to say that my degree is now old enough to drink, right? And the gray hair comes from just being around the industry for a long time. Why am I giving this talk on economics? Is because I find a topic that's extremely interesting, and that I urge you, as you consider your own careers and you consider doing presentations and stuff, do that. I mean, if you find something you like, come up and talk. I'm particularly curious about finance. I'm a do-it-yourself investor kind of thing. Eventually I got this thing called a mortgage. What the heck is that? And then tried to figure out from there. I like economics. There's a couple of areas. One is the efficient market hypothesis, and the other one is behavioral economics. And behavioral economics will play a part here in a second. And then data science. Like, so I'm a few hours away from a capstone at Coursera, and I'll be done with that specialization. Let's talk about, sorry, just a second, the slides here are a little off. There you go, that's better. So let's talk about a little bit about economics. Economics as a discipline has been something that people have looked at for thousands of years. It was part of philosophy originally, but then, especially in the late 1700s kind of thing, it sort of coalesced as a discipline more of its own. Some people here may have heard of Adam Smith. He's the guy who came up with the notion of the invisible hand of the market, right? So what they were doing, that the market kind of arranges itself and guides what people will do. So that was a book called The Wealth of Nations in 1776. What people don't know is that Adam Smith, or don't know much, is that in 1759 he published a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiment, which is very interesting because the theory of moral sentiments dealt more with the motivations for why people do things. And it's interesting that 200, 300 years later, we're discussing some of that in behavioral economics. Moving up very quickly, in terms of where people were, economics kind of developed as in two major trends, macro and micro. We'll get to those in a second, throughout the 18th and 19th century. I wanted to point out a couple of people. Jeremy Bentham is interesting because one of the topics he discussed is that Jeremy Bentham introduced the notion of the panopticon, which is, he's the guy who originally developed like a prison where you would have someone in the center and you could watch all around it. And I would argue that Jeremy Bentham is kind of the inspiration, if you will, for a lot of the security monitoring you do nowadays. As a model, we want to watch what everyone's doing. And then David Ricardo was interesting because he introduced the notion, or he discussed the notion of comparative advantage. What's comparative advantage? Let's say you have two people, they both do task A and task B, and person number 1 is better at task A and at task B than person number 2. It's still in the benefit for both people, 1 and 2, for one of them to specialize in one thing and one for the other. And I'm butchering economics, as I mentioned, but it's the notion that introduces specialization. So as a whole, we've been refining the science of economics for a few years. Getting into the 19th and 20th century, you start the discussion around what should governments be doing, how should you stimulate an economy. Now, some of you may have heard of John Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes is I would say, the philosophical inspiration for the quantitative easing that we've been doing as an economy since the 2008 crisis. The idea that you can boost demand by increasing the money supply, for example. In contrast to that, you've had people, Frederick Hayek was one of them that kind of discusses the view of the market as something that is better left to the market itself, and you should have the animal spirits of the market kind of fight off each other. This is interesting because throughout the years we've been kind of narrowing down what people expect to see in terms of how people react, how people act in a market. It was particularly, so the little stars here, the little medals here, are actually Nobel Prizes in economics that have been awarded since the 40s. These guys will come back to us in a second, but for example, Arrow and DeBreur, they won their Nobel Prize by basically proving that a market mechanism is an efficient way of organizing and of obtaining outputs, if you will. Moving then into the latter part of the 20th century, we start getting into a more mathematical analysis of economics, right? And some of you may have heard of John Nash, right? The amazing movie, amazing book, A Beautiful Mind. So John Nash was one of the leading figures in what's called game theory, which is the analysis of how people play games and in a more strategic way. Then in the mid-70s, we start getting into the notion of treating information as a different good, the notion of information economics. And this will play a huge part in what we talk about for security. George Akerlof, Michael Spence, and Joseph Stiglitz, they won the Nobel Prize in 2001, I think it was, for their work on this, and it'll play a huge part in what we do as security. Now, one tidbit, George Akerlof, his wife is Janet Yellen, who's the current chairwoman of the Fed. Right, so these kind of things play together. But as we get to security itself, the economics of security, it kind of started from a computer security perspective, looking to in the 80s and 90s, as the Department of Defense started looking into how it's spending security money. It started with some authors collaborating. Ross Anderson and Hal Varian did some very nice collaboration in the early 2000s that eventually led to the WISE Security Conference in 2002, the Workshop on the Economics of Information Security. And I say that if I could, you know you can nominate people for Nobel Prizes, for the Peace Prize, you cannot do that for economics. But if I did, I would nominate these two guys. Now, there's two areas to economics. The first one, the two major areas to economics. First one is macroeconomics, and I realize I'm butchering the video. And macroeconomics is the study of the broader economy, like how is the money supply going to affect the economic output of a nation and so on. It's not as interesting to us from a security perspective, unless you count that as the economy goes into an expansion or contraction, that affects budgets and what have you. It is interesting that it does study things like unemployment. Unemployment is more of a, unemployment is interesting. There's different elements to unemployment. There's frictional unemployment, cyclical, and structural, and that will play a part in security later on. But that's macroeconomics. Microeconomics is a lot more interesting. Microeconomics is the other major branch of economics, and that's the study of scarcity. It's the study of how people in a particular interaction are going to look for the best outcome in a transaction. It's as it says here, it's the study of individuals from markets. when you hear the notions of supply and demand, yes, it plays a part in macro as well, but here is where people, you're analyzing how people are maximizing their own utility. In other words, you're trying to, in a particular transaction, do the best that you can for yourself. That's the theory. And within microeconomics is where you find the notion of discussing information economics and both decision and game theory. So it is extremely interesting from, that's the area where if you're going to study how security affects economics, that's where you're going to find yourself most of the time. It's not a formal part of economics, but I find that behavioral economics is absolutely essential as a security professional for you to understand. Behavioral economics is more a multidisciplinary field, if you will, that includes psychology, it includes finance, it includes economics, it includes sociology. And it's, as the title says there, it's, the funny expression is the bounded rationality of economic agents, which basically is a very nice way of saying people are not rational. We don't always maximize. You're not always trying to, you're not always calculating the maximum payoff for a particular transaction. We have our inherent biases, and we'll act on those biases. And behavior economics is a way of analyzing that and looking at how we can factor that in as you develop systems for this. Behavior economics, it was started, I mean, one of the most famous names is Daniel Kahneman. He won the Nobel Prize a few years ago. And there are other authors, Richard Taylor's, Cass Sisting. If you like podcasts and if you like to listen to this from a more, not as academic stuff, both Dan Ariely and Stephen Levitt have excellent content out there. Dan Ariely is a researcher out of Duke, and Stephen Levitt out of the University of Chicago. And so, and they study, as it says here, cognitive biases. And these are biases that we have. So for example, intertemporal choice, hyperbolic discounting. We will prefer an outcome, a smaller outcome now than a better outcome in the future. And that explains why I had a bagel this morning, right? Because I should probably have had a salad, right? And behavior economics is fundamentally about the study of these biases and also of incentives. How do you incentivize people to do things? Anyway, that's behavior economics. I promise you, this does come back to security. The other thing I want to talk about are markets. A market, what is a market, right? You talk about the stock market, you talk about the labor market. Well, a market is more of a model than anything else. It's how you're going to interact, to analyze how people interact. And in a market, you have something called the price. And the price is a signal on that market to indicate how much you should produce or not produce. And a market is more of a social, it's not a perfect description of things, but it's a very good approximation. And remember I mentioned De Boer and Arrow a few slides back? Well, they kind of proved that for some definition of people being better off, a market is a very efficient way of achieving that, buying and selling goods. So how do you get an efficient market, which is what the slide says here? You need a number of things to happen. You need to have lots of people buying and selling. You need to have what's called property rights. It's the notion that if I buy something, I get the full benefit of that, and if I sell something, I get the full benefit of that. And I also pay the same costs. So if I have the full property rights for a particular transaction. You assume that there is perfect information. People know what they're buying and selling. You assume that people are rational. Hey, we talked about that in a little bit, right? And you assume things like low transaction costs and that, as it says here, non-increasing returns to scale. We are going to see in the next few slides how all of this is different in the security, in information security specifically. If you don't have those conditions, you have what are called market failures. And they don't mean a market crash.
Can you define non-increasing returns to scale?
Hold your thought. I will get non-increasing returns to scale. You'll see that in a second. It's the notion that the more as you get larger, your cost at some point will rise again. hold that thought. Thank you for the question, though. You have market failures. If you don't have a large number of buyers and sellers, you get into what's called a monopoly or a monopsony, right? A monopsony is when you have fewer buyers than you need. And we all know, we all heard of monopolies, and there's several negative things to monopolies, but what I will say is that from an economic perspective, from an information perspective, monopolies are interesting because they try to do, they find a way of doing price discrimination, of selling you something for what you can bear to pay and not necessarily what they are willing to sell for, right? So I'll sell you a $10 bottle of, what is a $10 bottle of wine, I'll sell it to you for 20 because I know that you can pay. Property rights, if you don't have property rights, you get into what's called an externality. And that's the notion that you make an economic decision, but you are not responsible for the costs associated with that decision. The typical example we always talk about is pollution, right? If you pollute, you may not, by definition, you're not bearing the full cost of that pollution, right? Society as a whole is. And that has very interesting consequences because that leads to things such as free riding, right? People, if I'm not paying for the cost of pollution, I'll just keep polluting. If I'm not paying for all that cleanup, what's my incentive? What's my economic incentive to not do that? And there's also positive externalities in that if you don't capture the full value of something positive, you're not going to do as much of it. People usually refer to education as something that has a positive externality. People should capture more of their education. And I am. Other market failures that we talk about is if you don't have information about what's going on, you get into what's called information asymmetry. You don't know the full details about what you're buying and you're selling. That leads to things such as it says here, adverse selection. This is particularly interesting in the field of insurance, right? What ends up happening if you buy we analyze and say that, hey, listen, if only sick people, sorry, I shouldn't say sick, but if only sick people will go and buy insurance into a market, it's too expensive for a healthy person to join. So the premiums are going to be higher. Well, if the premiums are going to be higher, then only if you're really sick are you going to pay for that. And that's a negative feedback, if you will. There's a few others. We talked about the irrationality as a little bit. And then transaction costs are particularly interesting as well. If the cost of making a switch is too high, you're not necessarily going to make that switch, right? Some of you may have seen this from if you've taken econ in the past. This is your typical summarized version of a supply and demand curve, right? The way to read this chart is if you are a producer, right? What is your incentive to produce? It's so the quantity is over here, and the price is over here. Remember, price is a signal. So if the price is high, as a producer, it's you're incented to make more of whatever it is you're doing. By the same token, if you are a consumer and the price is high, you don't have an incentive to consume that much. As you lower the price of something, there is an increased demand, and as you lower the price of something, as you lower the price of that same something, there is a reduced supply, and at some point they meet, and the marginal, and typically the marginal cost is where the supply and demand are going to meet. Again, I'm butchering economics a little bit, but if you hold this thought for a second, we're going to get to that gentleman's question right now, which is, so what is the marginal cost? It's the cost that for you as a producer, it costs to make that next good, okay? So this is your typical marginal cost. You start off at first, you haven't produced much, so your cost per unit is pretty high as you have to set up a factory and you start hiring people and they don't produce as much early on and so on. Well, at some point you get into a groove and now your marginal cost kind of gets to where you're producing well, etc. At some point you're going to reach capacity and then you have to start paying overtime. Maybe you need, maybe your suppliers don't have as much of the raw materials, and you have to buy raw materials at a higher price. So your marginal costs increases. At that point in time, you'd probably open up another factory and so on. This is beautiful for physical goods. Digital goods are different. The digital good marginal cost curve is more like this. What this means is, at first, there's a higher cost as you're building something, but eventually, as you produce more of your digital good, the marginal cost decreases. And this is what's called an increasing return to scale, right? And this has extremely interesting consequences for software markets. Why? Well, if you have, in that curve, as I just showed you, you have very high fixed costs and very low marginal costs. What this means is that it introduces the notion that this kind of market will tend to forget security, right? In general, the way that a company is going to survive in this market is by getting as large as they can and monopolizing that market as fast as they can, right? So this market is prone to monopolies. Well, if that market is prone to monopolies, then we're getting to a strong incentive for that company to go into a market race to have first mover advantage. Time to market becomes essential. Getting the minimum viable product out the door as fast as it's humanly possible is absolutely essential. And this is why we can't have nice security. Why? Because security is something that is really hard to measure. Security is something that's really difficult to, it doesn't add to that, it doesn't add to this dynamic here. And I'm not saying that, it's not that companies are evil, absolutely not. It's the rational economic decision to do a first mover advantage, right? And this is why I think that as an industry, we should stop saying, oh, the software companies they're stupid for not fixing bugs, etc. It's not that. It's not in their economic interest. And it's absolutely rational for them to do so. I think that's the underlying message here. Now, what I wanted to cover is that there's a ton of other things as well. You have notions that once you get to this market, you start appealing, it's in your rational interest to appeal to complementary goods. You build a platform and you build around it. How many here heard Steve Ballmer yell, developers, developers, developers at the Microsoft conference, right? It's a famous video on YouTube. He was absolutely right. That's how Microsoft won. Microsoft didn't win by making the best operating system. Right? It won by making the best, a minimum viable operating system that appealed to a lot of developers. In my opinion, and I speak for myself, not for my employer or anything, this is why I think Splunk got such a good position in the SIM market. Splunk built a really nice platform where you can build on top of. Right? And there's others as well. But anyway, so the reality is that information goods behave differently. And I think this has a profound effect on security. I covered information asymmetry. I talked about information asymmetry earlier. I want to get back to this for a second. Information asymmetry, this is the paper from George Akerlof, Markets for Lemons, that pretty much won him the Nobel Prize. It's the notion that, and I talked about this briefly, the dynamic that if you don't know the quality of something that you're buying, then it leads to a scenario where only people who don't have poor quality goods are going to want to sell it to you. Because if you sell a good quality, if you have a high quality good to sell, but you can't get a good price for it, you're not going to go into that market. Well, then the consequence, this is why you end up with the market for lemons, right? That's the used car type of analogy. That's where this came from. This has interesting consequences on how do you analyze this, how do you get information about a particular good. There were two mechanisms. One's called signaling, the other one's called screening. One was from Stiglitz, the other one was from Spence. I forget which one was which. I believe Spence was signaling and Stiglitz was screening. In signaling, what you do is you try to signal to your buyer that your good has higher quality. In screening, if you are the buyer, you try to screen out your sellers so that only good sellers are going to eventually make it through. And these are not perfect signals. Well, these are not perfect mechanisms. You know another word for the word signaling? It's certified, right? So if you getting a certification is nothing more than providing a signal that, you know what, I have some level of quality. As you can see, as you can imagine, this has tremendous consequences in information security. Oh, my product is certified and whatnot. This also leads to interesting scenarios where sometimes the certification process gets abused. I'm still very curious what's going to happen. I mean, I love the notion of the Let's Encrypt movement that we now have, everybody can have SSL certs. But what's the consequence of that from a signaling perspective for the quality, for the security of a certificate? Anyway, that's signaling. Screening has another name. Anybody here work for a vendor, software vendor, or service vendor? Or, like, I work for a software vendor. Everybody heard of an RFP? Right? What is an RFP if not a screening mechanism? So this is why we have, so these are just examples of that being implemented in security. Jumping into security areas themselves. Any one of these next slides could be a 1-hour lecture of their own, so bear with me here. This came out, this is not new, by the way. What I'm talking about is not new. I read a paper not too long ago by Ian Grigg. Ian Grigg is a financial cryptographer. He's deeply involved with Bitcoin nowadays. And he actually argues that the market for security is not a market for lemons. It's not a market for lions. He talks about insurance. It's a market what he calls silver bullets. And it's interesting because it describes the dynamic of the market pretty well. Security goods are insufficient information. It means that the buyers don't really know what they're buying, and the sellers, they have some idea of what they're selling, but not that much as well, right? So you end up that the decisions about the markets are done on the signals and not on the security itself. In other words, you start looking for some external evidence of that something is secure, and you buy into that. You don't buy into the actual security of a good itself. And this leads to a very interesting herding effect in that, and again, I'm mentioning company names not as an endorsement or as a criticism, just as for reference. This is why whenever there is an incident, everybody calls Mandiant or FireEye, right? They may do good work, they may not do good work. I'm not getting into that. I'm getting into the economics of it's a signal that you're throwing out to your market. So this is extremely relevant. Other areas, software development by itself. I mentioned this briefly earlier. There is a tremendous failure in terms of getting the first to market. We get into issues of information asymmetry. This is the paper that Ross Anderson wrote back in 2001 that kind of got the whole economics of security going. How hard is it to tell if a product is secure or not? It's very difficult. So it's the rational expectation of a software vendor to get it with as little as they possibly can. And for us to expect different is naive, right? That's the message I'm trying to get across here. There's significant externalities in software development. I mean, the whole free open source movement. I mean, OpenSSL. How many people actually use OpenSSL versus how many people contribute to it? That's your typical free riding that comes from an externality, right? And a huge one, the owners of patching, right? Why do we get into a patch cycle? Well, because the vendor doesn't pay for the cost of the patches. He passes it on to the consumer, right? So to expect people to change, you have to understand why this happens in the first place, and which brings us to this lecture, right? Why I find economics so interesting. How we're going to solve this? Well, realistically, never mind if you like it or not, the economic approach to solving an externality is, for example, regulation. So we are going to see more regulation in security, and it's not because people are evil, it's because people are people, right? One example of externalities at play, right? And this was released late last year, that at some point there were 87% of Android devices were exposed to at least one high-risk vulnerability for a large period of time. Why is this? Because it was not in the phone manufacturer or the service provider's interest. They were not incented to fix that, to push that vulnerability out. Now, Google may have fixed it very quickly, but the model itself is not, it doesn't incent the service provider or the carrier sorry, the service provider or the phone manufacturer to push that upgrade out. So this is an example of why externalities play a part in security. Now, another interesting area is vulnerability markets and bug bounties, right? It's interesting that how you price a vulnerability has been a part of economics, or a part of the economics of security since pretty much when it started, right? You had the initial markets where iDefense and Tipping Point would buy vulnerabilities, and that has extremely interesting economic consequences. First of all, it lowers the transaction cost for buying and selling a vulnerability. If I know that I can go to some place and sell that, it's easier for me to do that. I may be incented to do more of that. By the same token, depending on how the market is structured, there may be a perverse incentive on that market. I believe it was Zerodium that put out a $1 million bounty on remote execution on a non-jailbroken iOS device. I'm not sure I don't think it's been paid yet. Well, but they're willing to pay $1 million for it. Wonderful. What are they going to do with it? I don't know. Are they going to give Apple the vulnerability right away? Probably not. They're going to sell it somewhere else. So the moment that you introduce this kind of payments, you can get into the notion of perverse incentives about the vulnerability. If you care about the vulnerability being fixed, are you going to give it to Apple, or are you going to give it to Zerodium and get $1 million? It depends. There were aspects around if you could sell the vulnerability only to your local government. I mean, that kind of creates a monopsony we were talking about earlier, right? So you only have if you only have one legal buyer, which is your government, what are you going to do about it? I mean, what does that tell you about the price that someone's going to pay for that? And I really recommend that you look up the work that the likes of BugCrowd are doing, and HackerOne and Zerodium in terms of bug bounties. It's extremely interesting. I like BugCrowd a lot. They've been doing some very interesting work in solving that information asymmetry in the security community itself. If you sell a vulnerability, how well are you doing that, and how are you going to how do you signal to a buyer that you are a legitimate researcher? Privacy is another huge area in terms of the economics of privacy are tremendously, very important in the sense that people analyze how do you actually behave. So for example, I talked about hyperbolic discounting earlier, right? Present benefit undervaluing future privacy. We keep talking about how people don't respect, they don't read the privacy, they don't read the permissions that an app asks for. Of course they don't read them, right? Why don't they read them? No matter how much you teach them that, hey, listen, you should pay attention to these specific permissions being asked, no one is going to do that. Not only they may not have the technical expertise to figure out what remote access means on an application, they are under the influence of a bias called hyperbolic discounting. I want to get my Flappy Bird game going, right? If you understand that, you're going to be a better security professional, right? And I talked a little bit about monopolies. We can talk about it later. The whole area of risk management is pretty much economics applied. You find that how much you invest in security. There's an interesting model called the Gordon-Leb model that tells you that really you should really apply to fix a particular vulnerability 37% of your expected loss, and it will go through the calculations. There is a battle going on between qualitative and quantitative risk management. People love their high, medium, low matrices, and other people love their statistics-based, probability-based calculations. This is everything to do with how much you're going to invest. Information asymmetry plays a huge part. One of the areas I didn't cover too much is what's called the principal-agent problem in economics. And that is, if you have two people, and you are the principal, and you have an agent, you have someone working on your behalf. If there is an information asymmetry in that you don't know what that agent is actually doing, there is an incentive for that agent to act on their self-interest more than your as a principal. This is why I'm not picking on particular fields, but for example, real estate. So if you are a real estate agent, there's been research that says that you sell your house for more than you would sell a comparable person's houses, and you leave it in the market for longer. That's the Freakonomics stuff earlier on. Why is that? Because, hey, your interest of selling your house is different than when you're selling your own versus when you're selling someone else's. Right? The same thing applies in other areas. The thing I wanted to mention here is that I've been in many audits, security audits over the years, and one cases I've heard, cases I've seen, is you come up again with lots of vulnerability, you come lots of findings on an audit, high, medium, low finding. Right? I've seen people argue more, not for fixing the vulnerability, but for reclassifying it, not as a high, but as a medium. Why do they do that? Well, because only high vulnerabilities get bumped up to management, right? So that's a principal agent problem at play here, right? And if you don't understand that, you're going to, oh, but they didn't fix all of that. Of course not, they were not incented to do so. Insurance is another huge area we could get into in a lot of detail. I've done fraud prevention for a number of years, and I think that cybercrime is an extremely interesting area from an economic perspective. You have the whole liability and incentives play here about credit card security, what's going to happen. I mean, we now have, theoretically, chip cards, chip and pin or chip and sign cards in the US. We've had them in Canada for a little longer. And how does that affect the liability? This is a little more specific to fraud prevention, but in a broader security discussion, underground markets are tremendously interesting. Right? I wish I could, I think next session I'm going to do it will be on underground markets alone. There's something called the Red Queen hypothesis in economics. And that is the fact that if you don't evolve, you die. And we see that happening in underground markets all the time. Right? You see prices for exploits dropping over time because they get more efficient. Underground markets are extremely efficient. And this is interesting for you to analyze, not because you want to necessarily close your technical vulnerability, but if you understand what the economic objective of your attacker is, maybe you can try to fix that issue as opposed to necessarily your technical issue. And there's tons of other externalities. This would not be a presentation in 2016 if I did not include ransomware. Right? So here's the mandatory ransomware slide. The thing about ransomware that's extremely interesting from an economic perspective is that up until now, so why does everyone care about this? Why did this thing blow up as much as it did, and it's going to keep blowing up? Because from an economic perspective, two things happened. Number one, it's now the criminal element found a very easy way to monetize it. Whereas before, if they broke into your machine and they were able to get remote execution, they would use you as a spam platform and sell out and use you to sell spam. They still do that, by the way, but now they can charge $400 for your machine to do something. So it's their economic incentives to do that. And this is why ransomware picked up so much.
Well, the other thing about that, though, real quick, is that the ransomware, they actually have to behave as a legit business in order for people to actually get comfortable paying them.
So it speaks to, thank you, it speaks back to that Red Queen hypothesis here that if you, as a ransomware platform, if you don't know how to behave, people are not going to trust you, and they're not going to pay, and you're going to not do that. I think ransomware is extremely interesting in a morbid sense, I apologize, in the sense that it brings back to the user some of the onus of doing security. Most people wouldn't care. I mean, when you talk to end users, they may not necessarily care. Oh yeah, somebody sent a spam from my account. I don't care. So I may have to pay $400, $500. I do care. So I'm still curious to see what the long-term effect is going to be of ransomware on user perceptions of security. I think that's an interesting area to do research over the next year or so, right? Which brings us to security awareness. I think that if you are doing anything to do with security awareness for your user community, you absolutely must understand behavior economics. You absolutely should understand that people have their biases, and I urge you to please do not treat your users as stupid. They are not stupid. They are doing, when they don't follow your security advice, they are doing the exactly rational thing to do. There's a fantastic paper by Cormac Harlett from Microsoft. I have it on the notes later, called So Long and No Thanks for the Externalities. The paper is from 2008 or 6, I forget. But it's a little dated in the examples that he gives in terms of spam and things like that. But it's a fantastic paper arguing that people ignoring security advice is absolutely the rational thing for them to do. So we tell people, hey, listen, you should pay attention to the HTTPS on the browser. Oh, by the way, you should check to see if the domain is a valid format. Oh, by the way, you have to check to see if the certificate hasn't expired, and so on and so on and so on. All that has an economic cost. And on aggregate, people are rational when they ignore it. And if we don't take that into account when we write security policy, when we write end-user documentation, we're just setting ourselves up for failure. Right? The same thing about the principal agent problem applies here as well. I mean, people acting on their self-interest. It's 5 p.m. on a Friday, and you have to send a file out to your partner somewhere else. Are you really going to go through the trouble of setting up secure file sharing and exchanging keys and whatnot, or are you just going to send an email out, right? It's human behavior, right? It's not stupid, it's the rational thing that you're doing from an economic perspective. It may not be what you want, but it's the rational thing that you're doing. This is just an example that came from Google last year on the kind of things they've done to address behavior economics in a little bit. This was how Chrome used to do. Warnings. You see that they had multiple levels of warning, and they simplified that on Chrome 46. Why did they do that? Because they found through a data-focused analysis that people were not paying as much attention to these kind of errors here, right? There's an interesting study on human behavior called the paradox of choice. And if I find the reference, I mean, hit me up on Twitter or not later, I'll send it to you. They analyzed whether people would buy more if you give them six choices of jam, or whether you give them 24 choices of jam. And people were literally choosing to buy less if they had more choice, right? Kind of the same thing applies here. I'll just wrap up by talking. The security labor market is extremely interesting as well from our own perspective, right? You end up with, do we have 0% unemployment in security? I don't know, maybe we do. This introduces all the mania about automating things, right? If you can't hire people, you're going to look for an alternative in terms of automation and headcount reduction. You should be aware of that as a security professional, right? I find it interesting that I recommend, like I have a little bit in networking as well, and software-defined networks are the rage, have been the rage in networking for the past few years. And everyone kind of recommends network engineers to learn some programming and automation and scripting and what have you. I give the same advice to security people. Learn some programming, learn how to automate things, extremely useful. And then the same discussion of information asymmetry applies here as well. And I talked about those as a bit. How do you signal that you are a good security professional? Well, one of the ways is credentials. And you get your university degree, you get your professional certification, your vendor certification, what have you. Right? This is the rational way of dealing with the information asymmetry of hiring someone. And from the screening perspective, we should expect interviews to be a little more annoying, to be a little more confusing, etc. People are trying to screen it out, are trying to screen whether you are a good professional or not. I will say that perverse incentives also exist in security in terms of if the money that someone can get in security is very high, then the incentive for someone to cheat their way into security is higher as well. And this kind of drives why you have certification paper mills and whatnot. And this is one of the reasons why interviews are getting tougher and tougher and tougher. Anyway, just to wrap up, we looked at a few broader economic concepts. We talked a little bit about markets and market failures. We talked about information asymmetry, which I think is absolutely essential for security. And if I could do my best Steve Ballmer impression here, I would not be shouting developers, developers, developers. I would be shouting incentives, 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 right? If we as security professionals do not understand the incentives behind, the economic incentives behind why people are doing things, we're just spinning our wheels, right? I think some of the key areas to study are, as I mentioned here, end user behavior. If you have anything to do with user awareness, or whether as someone just dealing with your end user population, or whether you are a consumer yourself. Risk management, huge conversation there, and what we can expect from software development. Expecting people to provide a higher level of security than minimal on their products is not rational. And if we expect that, we're going to fail. I'll leave with a call to action. As a consumer, right, understand how do you play a part in a market. You always hear people talking about, hey, if you're not paying for the product, that means that you are the product on social media. Understand how that works, right? Understand what incentives are there. Hey, listen, buy now because this is the last day to buy something. Understand the biases that you are involved in. I think one of the most influential books I ever read is called Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion, right? By a guy named Robert Cialdini. I highly recommend it. As a citizen, I'm not going to get into politics, but understand what incentives are at play when you are dealing in your community, right? Are you going to expect who is going to take part in community discussions? Who is going to take part in government? What are the incentives for doing so? Right? And then, lastly, as a security professional, I think we should absolutely focus on the right levers. Right? We should absolutely understand the incentives and how people behave. And I'll leave you with one final thought, which is, isn't a lot of what we do in security nowadays itself an externality? In other words, we are asking people, hey, listen, you should not do this. And we make that as a diktat, and people, yeah, you should not, you can only use the approved whatever. People are going to rationally look for a way around it. People are going to rationally ignore us, and we shouldn't do that. Right? Thank you very much for listening to me. I do have the slides up in about 12 minutes, if a slide share is to be believed. I'll happily take any questions you may have. Yes, sir?
You mentioned that underground, which I assume you mean criminal markets, are extremely efficient. Why do they experience fewer or lesser market failures than legitimate markets?
So for the video, the question is, why do underground markets experience fewer failures than traditional markets? Is that the question?
Yeah.
I would say that this happens because the markets, they have fewer of those failures. All those conditions I listed, there are lots of players, buyers and sellers. There is enough information in that market. In other words, if you're buying, there are knowledgeable buyers and sellers. There are the cost of the transaction is particularly low. You can go to there is competition in that market. So I would say those markets are more evolved than our traditional markets.
Do they not have the information asymmetry problems?
They have. Everybody has information asymmetry problems, but they resolve them through exactly the same methods that we do. They resolve them through signaling and through screening. So, for example, you are only going to be able to buy in a particular underground market if you've been vetted into that market. And by the way, I'm going to signal to you that I'm selling you a good batch of stolen credit cards by giving you a few cards up front. If you use those cards and those cards fail, I'm going to pay you back. Right? So they have information asymmetry is a condition in any market, and they have resolved some of those. So you had a comment?
Yeah, I was just going to comment that, like, you know, the dark web markets are really the epitome of the free market idea.
To some extent,
no,
yeah.
You know,
No regulation.
No regulation, and all of that. Yeah, that has to be part of the contribution.
Okay. Any other questions? And incredibly enough, I wrote up in slides. I have, if you download the slides later, I have slide links, Twitter, I have a list of people to follow, books, workshops, etc. that you can take a look at. I highly just download this link later. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks.